Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today in the final webinar of our four-part series on smart solar siting for New England, where the partners here today, American Farmland Trust, Conservation Law Foundation, Vote Solar, Acadia Center, and the Vermont Law School will share on this last webinar what we've learned over the past 2 years, seeking to find ways to reduce conflicts over the siting of solar projects. I'd like to take just a moment to thank the organizations who have funded and supported this work, the John Merck Foundation, the Barr Foundation, and the National Agricultural Library. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping issues. All of the attendees are muted, so there's no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow at the top allows the panel to shrink and reopen, and you'll be able to see a question section of the control panel. What we are also doing is recording this webinar, and we will make it available online along with all of the other resources which are already available online. And we will send that link to the recording to everyone who has registered, along with resource links for the things that we will present today. Brief history, if you're just joining us for this one, we spent 2 years working together to identify quite a number of different stakeholder groups and bring their thoughts and values together to work through a detailed review of processes, policies, and some best practices in terms of finding ways to move forward with solar and land conservation to meet our goals for clean energy in New England. We have gone through lay of the landscape for the first one, went through balancing land conservation, trying to advance the market, and today we will be working through how we can actually turn state and local priorities into sound policy. And just briefly, we wanted to let you know who has been attending this. We've had 300 registrants, ranging from a good number of regional planners with municipalities to quite a number in the solar industry, state and federal agency staff, land trust staff, farmers and landowners, and other nonprofit attendees. So we've been really excited that everyone's been able to engage on this incredibly important topic with us. Today we're going to briefly introduce everyone. I'll start with me since I've already been speaking. My name is Emily Cole. I am the Climate and Agriculture Program Manager for American Farmland Trust here in New England. In just a moment, we will introduce the rest of our partners, but after that, we will revisit the concept of smart solar siting, why we're here today, quickly recap prior webinars, look through some of our best practices and some of our guidelines that we've put together to really develop some sound policy approaches. And then we're going to hear from some stakeholders about what are some opportunities for action that they see in New England in the near future. And then at the end, we will have time for Q&A. So don't forget about the question panel on the side of your screen. With that, I will pass it over to our next partner, Genevieve, to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Genevieve Byrne. I'm a staff attorney and assistant professor at the Institute for Energy and the Environment at Vermont Law School. And I'm also part of our Farm and Energy Initiative, which is a collaboration between the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems and the Energy Institute, and funded by the National Agricultural Library. On this project, I've really been working on the policy side of things, looking at the whole suite of policies affecting solar siting across New England.
Thank you. Go ahead, Deborah.
Hi, I'm Deborah Donovan from Acadia Center. I am our lead on our Clean Power Initiative, and I'm also the director of our advocacy work in the state of Massachusetts. Acadia Center, it's our mission as a regional clean energy organization to advocate for equitable and clean energy solutions for a livable climate and a stronger, more equitable economy. And we work throughout the Northeast.
Thanks, Deborah. Phelps?
Hi, everyone. My name is Phelps Turner. I'm a senior attorney at Conservation Law Foundation. CLF is a regional nonprofit environmental advocacy organization working throughout New England. Through our Farm and Food Initiative, we work to shape a sustainable regional food system to help increase fresh food access, create jobs, and foster healthy communities. And through our Clean Energy Climate Change program, we work to equitably decarbonize our economy, advocating for policies and projects that boost low-cost, locally made energy. Thanks.
Thanks, Phelps. And Sean.
Hey there, Sean Guerin. I'm the Senior Director for the Northeast at Vote Solar. We're a nationwide advocacy group working to bring solar into the mainstream and make it accessible and affordable to everybody. And we're part of this partnership because I think solar is very well placed to make the world a better place and our energy system a better place, including for conservation and agriculture, as well as other things like clean energy and energy justice.
Sean, do you want to introduce who's coming up with us next?
Yeah. Later today, we'll be joined by a panel of stakeholders to really get a sense of some of the different perspectives on our challenges ahead of us and the path forward. So we'll be joined by my colleague, Lavanya Pulavital Barrera, who is our Access and Equity Program Manager at Vote Solar. Brian Wick, who's the Executive Director of the Cape Cod Cranberry Growers Association, Sue Anderbaugh, the Climate and Energy Program Manager at the Nature Conservancy in Rhode Island, and Zada Shai, who is the CEO of Nexamp, a solar developer in the region. So looking forward to that conversation. And
I am going to take a moment and launch a poll that we hope everyone takes a second to answer. And then we will move forward. Okay. So today we're asking, what have you found most helpful from this webinar series so far? Data analyses, regulatory examples and options, information on land conservation and solar compatibility, hearing from a diverse set of perspectives, and strategies to advance a policy conversation in your state or town. So let's see where we have landed. It looks like we have a significant number, find that most helpful on land conservation and solar compatibility, which is really, I think, exciting for me to hear. Hearing from a diverse set of perspectives, which is incredibly important. And then a nice distribution of data analysis, legal regulatory examples, and then strategies to advance policy conversations. So that's great. And with that, I will go ahead and pass this on to Sean.
Sure. So I'm just briefly going to try and remind us, since I think we covered this most thoroughly in the first webinar, of why it is that we're having this conversation, why we're leading this effort. Starting with the need for solar, smart solar siting, and specifically the need for accelerated solar development. We've heard from the Acadia Center and their Energy Vision 2030 that we in New England need to develop 9,300, and I've been told 20, not 40, so that's a mistake on my part, megawatts of solar by 2030. With 5-ish acres per megawatt, we're talking about a major amount of land that will have to be covered with solar panels or integrated with solar panels, whether on rooftops or ground mounted or elsewhere. The Brattle Group came up with a report recently for New England as well that looked towards 2050. And I should say both of these reports are, not necessarily as accelerated as it seems climate change is requiring us to move forward. So probably these numbers will be larger in order to properly address the current science of climate change and what it demands. But the Brattle Group thought that we needed to be moving towards developing 2,000 to 5,000 megawatts of solar per year between now and 2050. So a very rapid acceleration of development from the few hundred megawatts that we're building currently to 2,000 to 5,000 megawatts. So we're going to have to build a great deal of solar to address climate change in this region and the other ills of our current energy system. Do you want to move to the next slide? I thought I would also real quick touch on the need for smart solar siting from a conservation and agriculture perspective. In New England, according to the Harvard Forest Report, we're losing 65 acres of forest land per year, which is a real significant loss of some of the most important wildlife landscapes, some of the most beautiful landscapes that attract tourists and make it so great to live in New England. I'm a hiker myself, spent a lot of time in the White Mountains. And then the American Farmland Trust's own report on farms under threat found that 2,000 acres of farmland are converted per year nationwide, or actually that might be per day. Maybe Emily can come on and tell us. But a great deal of land is being converted from farmland to other purposes. And that means that we're not growing food as locally. We're not supporting, again, wildlife and some of the other things that make this region so important. And if you look at the top most threatened states, looking at conversion, but also aging farmers and other threats to farms, you see that several of the New England states are very high on the list in terms of places where farms are most under threat. So at a high level, we need to be both developing solar and conserving our land and supporting agriculture. But solar is a great tool for actually balancing these two needs, the need for clean energy development and the need for conservation. Solar is flexible to be built in smaller swaths of land than a lot of other clean energy technologies. So you could build it on farms on marginal land, as we've learned. You can build it on rooftops. It also can be built in a way that supports local agriculture and maintains the soil properties that make our land good for farming. So you could actually build pollinator-friendly solar projects and things that support local agriculture. And finally, it can be an added source of revenue to some of our more rural areas in the region in order to help support local farmers, local communities to invest in conservation and really uplift our financial ability to survive and to continue to conserve the land and to farm. So with all of that, this is why we see the opportunity to really dig in on this issue and find not only a compromise, but in fact, a better path forward for smart solar siting. With that, I'm going to hand it off for a quick review of the webinars that we've had so far and some of the key takeaways we've gotten to it. So I think, Deborah, you're up first.
Here I am. Thank you, Sean. And just wanted to thank everybody who's here today and for everyone who's joined us over the last 4 weeks. And what we're going to do is just quickly step through recapping the prior 3 webinars that have gotten us to where we are today. And the theme of the first webinar was policies, programs, and progress. We reviewed some of the information similar to what Sean just presented to us around the role of how important solar is in achieving a decarbonized economy, and looked at just setting some baseline information around the status of farmland and forests in New England and the pressures that they're under. And we also presented the ways that outcomes can be driven by the way things are defined in regulation and statute, and which regulatory authority has jurisdiction over siting and other related policies that may be putting pressure or creating demand for clean energy resources such as solar. And we reviewed from one of the handouts for that day the basic principles of stakeholder engagement. During the discussion with our team and the panelists that joined us, we had a number of quite great questions from the audience and spent some time talking about addressing environmental justice in the process of achieving our solar targets, in addition to the other goals that we have. and ways to prioritize protection of farmland and forest land through some of the more effective policies, but also digging into what some of the barriers are and what some of the objectives are for developers. And one takeaway from there was that a lot of it is driven by interconnection costs, and that is a really big driver for what decisions and proposals developers are pursuing. And the importance of prioritizing community engagement, and in particular, focusing on things that might be otherwise overlooked as stakeholder issues, such as tenant farmers and the economic pressures that they are under relative to their landlords. Next slide. This slide here just describes what the sources of some of the materials were in terms of our handouts, and I'd like to actually close by extending a very hearty thank you to Lucy Bullock-Seeger from Blue Wave Solar for being our guest on our discussion panel at the end of webinar 1. And now I'm going to turn over to Phelps to recap webinar number 2.
Thanks, Deborah. I'm here to recap the second webinar. As the title of our webinar indicates, our topic was how to find a balance between our need for solar development in order to combat climate change and our need for farm and forest land conservation in order to protect agriculture and the underlying land. As we saw in the results of the poll we just held, and as Sean just mentioned, finding a balance between our climate and conservation goals is of critical importance. We had a great discussion, and some of the key takeaways, as highlighted on this slide, were first to consider policies that do not incentivize or penalize forest siting. In other words, in order to avoid forest fragmentation and loss of carbon sequestration, policymakers should consider policies that do not steer solar toward forest land, but also should consider policies that do not make it harder to develop solar than any other type of development. Second, there was a general consensus among the presenters and the panelists for preferentially using previously disturbed, degraded, or developed farm and forest land for solar siting. And third, to categorize and map lands to inform and support preferred siting policies. And we heard that in order to inform policies that prefer siting in one or more areas over others, we heard about the utility of tools that identify go, no-go areas or green light, red light areas for solar siting. Next slide, please. We focused on 2 handouts in this webinar, and I urge folks to go take a look at them if they haven't already. One was on meeting New England's solar energy needs on contaminated sites and rooftops. And this, the key takeaway from this handout was that the policies that expand the ability of rooftop solar and solar on contaminated sites can relieve development pressures on farms and forests. And the second handout was farmland and forest solar siting land use scenarios. This handout walks through the potential solar capacity of 4 different farmland and forest land siting locations and the extent to which various percentages of these lands could be used toward meeting our New England state's clean energy goals. Before passing it off, I want to close with a very special thank you to the guests who joined us for that webinar: Ellen Griswold at Maine Farmland Trust, Eliza Donahue at Maine Audubon, and David Sutherland at the Nature Conservancy. Thank you.
Hi, and I'm going to be just doing a short recap of our webinar 3. The title of that webinar was Growing the Solar Market with Smart Siting, and it really focused on how much solar has expanded in New England thus far, what the market is looking like today, and how we can continue to grow solar development in New England in a smart way using those alternative sites, and how the different costs and benefits for that changed based on how you structure your project. And we also heard a bit about barriers to solar development for low-income communities. So in terms of the status of the New England solar market, we heard that the cost to install solar has dropped a huge amount, by more than 70%. And what we're really seeing in terms of development is a lot of small distributed projects, so less than 5 megawatts in capacity. Community solar is really driving the growth in New England, along with the policies that allow community solar. But with the land constraints in New England, we also see that siting issues are more acute than in areas that have lots of open space available for development. So we really need to balance land use and environmental policies with that need for solar. Next slide. So in terms of policies accelerating solar development, we went over a whole list of policies that you can see on the slide here. Renewable portfolio standards and different really ambitious state climate and energy goals without a real federal policy in place for clean energy. We're seeing this really driven on a state by state level, including different procurements that are mandated for clean electricity or solar energy specifically, and then different net metering and feed-in tariff programs that allow for specific types of development. We also talked about streamlining or fast-tracking permitting for different types of preferred projects, and how you can use these policies to target specific sites or preferred sites for solar development. We then heard about different costs based on development scenarios, looking at sort of the all-in costs of solar when it's developed in different ways, as well as cost drivers and different barriers to certain projects like roof-mounted projects. And some of the key takeaways were to really identify preferred sites and connect those preferred sites to solar developers, to invest in preferred designs for solar development, and to do whatever we can to improve interconnection costs and policies. Next slide. And finally, we heard about Vermont Law School's work with low-income solar, trying to expand equity in siting and bringing solar development to different populations, and heard about some of the siting, financial, and informational barriers to developing low-income solar, as well as some of solutions that help overcome those barriers, like the importance of group net metering, of impact investors, of using low to moderate income adders and grants, and developing strong partnerships between organizations to help facilitate that type of development. I encourage you to take a look at some of our handouts from webinar 3. Those were the Smart Solar Siting Policy Options document, our cost analysis, as well as our guiding principles document for solar development. And I just want to give a big thank you to our 2 guests from webinar 3, Dave Gall from the Solar Energy Industries Association and Jeannie Oliver from Vermont Law School.
Thank you, Genevieve. I am going to move us along into some of the meat and potatoes of today, which is to really think about our development of some, I would say, process insights and how to make that approach to developing policy really sound and really engaging with stakeholders, but also ensuring that you are meeting your state climate, energy, and natural resource goals. And so that's really the first thing that I want to address. If you are a state entity or even a local entity trying to determine how you can move clean energy forward, but you have land preservation goals, you have natural resource goals, you have other energy efficiency goals that need to be considered, and all will play a part in how you can move this forward. And understanding the policy context around those and what you are able and unable to do is really a first step in figuring out how can you move this forward. After that, it's really about planning process and engagement, which I'll touch on in just a moment. But I think this graphic is helpful in really showing that this is a lot of moving pieces. There are the actual working policies, there are the goals represented by some of these different gears, but then there are all of these external drivers, and taking a step back and reviewing where your state priorities lie, what is already in the policy, what is already in policy and laid out, is really important to understand. If you're moving one piece forward, how is it going to impact the others? If you have really significant land preservation goals and land conservation goals, which AFT strongly supports, how does that impact your ability to site smartly on farmland? How does that impact your ability to, say, put dual use out there, where you can still continue to have agriculture and clean energy? So this is a really important step, as I think a first step in understanding how you're going to develop a more sound approach to policy in your municipality, your locality, or your state. The next would be to really make sure that the process is transparent and the process is open and it's clear, it's fair, and it's data-driven. When you have a transparent process from the very beginning, you are going to earn far more trust, and you are going to find that your stakeholders will feel more comfortable engaging, hopefully, in this process. And that's really important, because when you are addressing these various state priorities, there are also going to be myriad priorities from the stakeholders involved in this process. And making sure that you have really taken a look at all of the stakeholders and not just the more typical players in these processes, but actually include a more expansive group of stakeholders, you're going to get a clear idea of the wide variety of land values, energy values, and equity concerns that need to be addressed in a fair and transparent planning process, moving your state energy goals and needs forward. Farmers and producers and conservation organizations and environmentalists are certainly one aspect, but then you're going to have consumer advocates, environmental justice organizations, the actual frontline communities themselves, engaging in these, engaging conversation with these stakeholders is of utmost importance in knowing how you can move this forward in a most equitable and fair manner. And then, of course, you have a lot of the more typical actors, including the clean energy industries and state and municipal officials, and then the communities themselves where the solar may be sited. And this is simply a brief highlight of some of the concepts that we have laid out in our high-level guiding principles document. And this is by no means exhaustive, but I did want to highlight a few things that are here that are incredibly important to keep in mind as you're moving your clean energy process or program forward, whether it's in the planning stage or whether it's in a review stage moving forward with that. It's incredibly important to conduct some very thoughtful and meaningful community outreach in the communities that I mentioned previously with these different stakeholder groups, but also ensuring that you are engaging communities that have experienced this disproportionate burden of environmental harm. In today's clean energy push, it is really just a priority we hope that all states and municipalities engage with. We hope that you promote racial and economic equity in solar development, and that might be equitable access. It might be incentivizing community scale and low income solar development. And it's also ensuring communities where the solar is actually sited that they can benefit from the solar itself, whether it's lower energy costs or being able to directly own those solar assets. We hope that you can provide communities with plentiful opportunities to weigh in during this process, engaging in the program development, but also benefiting from the project in very concrete ways. Another way to think about this, to engage communities, to empower communities and promote equity is looking for local pools of investment capital for these projects. That is one way that we see as an opportunity to move this forward within a community. And lastly here, but certainly not last overall, is to consider the distinct challenges for low-income residents in both urban and rural settings. Those challenges are very different. You have a lot of siting that's occurring in rural settings, and then you have a lack of access often in urban settings. So there are really myriad situations that need to be included in development that can help address equity concerns. It can help address increased engagement and empowerment of the communities during this process. Another aspect of a fair and transparent process is trying to determine how can you balance land uses. And this is where a lot of stakeholder land values are important. And what we have done here is develop a spreadsheet tool to allow municipalities, localities, but more so likely states, to take a step back and look at some varying land use scenarios that could be moved forward aggressively or moved forward more conservatively in an attempt to meet clean energy goals. And so what you see here on the screen is an Excel spreadsheet that has these white cells where you can actually go in and adjust array sizes, and you can adjust percent goals for how many different percentage of this particular stakeholder group would you want to try to host. So I'm going to walk you through one example just very quickly, and this is a handout that is available on this, and it will also be available on the Farmland Information Center. So what you can see on your screen is the second tab of this spreadsheet, and there's a drop-down menu in this first yellow box in the upper left corner where you can choose the state. And it will auto-populate these gray cells with the same data that is in our farm and forest land use scenarios, and with the same data that is in Acadia Center's contaminated lands analysis. So this is pulling up stats from the ag census data on the number of farms that report having these different types of lands on their farm and how many acres that is in total. So for instance, in Connecticut, this is 2017 data, there is a reported 3,726 farms that report other land during the ag census, and that is farmyard, it might be ponds, it might be sort of wasteland, and it's typically not a large portion of someone's land, but it may be large enough to host a 0.5 megawatt or even a 1 megawatt array without actually impacting any agricultural production on that land. And so here's an example where you can think of a few different conservative, moderate, or aggressive scenarios in trying to meet some of those solar needs with that particular land. So for instance, if you want to say your most conservative is that you would want a 0.5 megawatt array, which might be 2 acres, 2.5 acres, and you want only 2.5% of farms across Connecticut to host that, this will actually tell you how many acres that is in total and your potential megawatt generation. So if you want to have a more moderate, you can go up to 5%, or aggressive is maybe a 1 megawatt array with 7.5% of farms hosting. This is completely adjustable and editable in all of these white cells for you to actually enter varying amounts so you can see what you might be able to achieve in these different scenarios. There's also dual use. We've been using a very conservative land use estimate, sort of an overestimate, if you will, of 10 acres for each megawatt of dual use. In reality, it's probably closer to 7 or 8, depending on the actual project design. But what we can see here in Connecticut, there's over 2,500 farms with close to 32,000 acres of permanent pasture. And if you have just a 1 megawatt array on 5% of lands, Connecticut could reach almost 130 megawatts without impacting agricultural production again. The next two are around woodlands, more conservative sizes and percentages for using farms that report having woodland to site your solar. And then this fourth analysis for this greenfield set of scenarios is we took a look at what the average annual rate of forest conversion was in each state. And this is not suggesting we are increasing that rate, but if we were to take 0.5% of what is already being developed or converted annually and not add, but actually replace 0.5% with solar versus other types of development, what you could achieve. And so with just subbing out 0.5% over the course of 5 years, then Connecticut could get 21 megawatts out of this. If we increase this, say, to 10 years, which we're just under probably 9 years now between today and the 2030 goals, so even if we put 9 years here, we can start to see if we were to just replace but not add to forest development, where could we move the needle? Underneath, we see the brownfield development scenarios, and this is what Acadia Center worked with Repower America's data set of all the contaminated acres across New England and filtering them down into ones that were had the best potential. They were not water and they were not still being actively used. So oftentimes this may be closed landfills. It could be Superfund sites that are not currently under use still or being reclaimed for other reasons. And so what we have here is two scenarios looking at those contaminated acres that are very close to transmission or to substations, so within 5/10 of a mile. Those are the ones that are going to be financially most reasonable to develop. And then there's a second set, which is sort of the next ring outward of substations. This is all of the potential, and it's technical potential, between 0.5 miles and 3 miles away. And we know that 3 miles away is very far away in terms of the reality of being able to develop a solar project. Being 3 miles away from a substation is difficult, but we're trying to put this out here to push to see what could be possible, especially if we have some updated interconnection availability in the future. So in an aggressive scenario, it might be that you are trying to actually get up to 75% of those contaminated acre sites that are within half a mile. And then beyond that, perhaps you're going to try to develop 50% of those sites that are between 0.5 and 3 miles away. And you can see in Connecticut, this is technical potential, and we haven't actually moved through and gone and double checked every single small site. So certainly there is a range here of what's possible that may be less than the full technical potential. But you can see here that that's almost 1.3 gigawatts of solar power in this aggressive brownfield scenario. And these percentages can also be adjusted and played around with depending on what each state feels is reasonable or attainable, or also, what seems to align with stakeholder land values and state priorities. At the bottom, you can see the varying combinations of these scenarios and get the total megawatt potential that could be developed and generated in these scenarios. And then you can go back up and you can compare it to the Acadia Center goal, or projected need of ground-mounted solar for 2030, or you can put in a custom target if there is something else that you are working with in terms of state data. So that's a lot of me talking about this spreadsheet. I hope that everyone takes a chance to download it and use it and play around with it. There's a lot of information on the initial tab that explains where this data came from, but really all of this data and these scenarios are very explained in depth and explained very well in the various handouts, including the Acadia Center solar acreage analysis, which is a handout today, and the farm and forest land use scenarios, which is another attached handout. So please take a look at those for a lot of the background information regarding how we developed these scenarios, but please go in and play around with these white cells on this tab and see where you can move the needle and where you can move things forward based upon your own state priorities and goals. Okay, so I'm going to take a moment and move us along and quickly talk about another resource that we have developed as a part of this project. And the Farmland Information Center, which is a website that we hope everyone visits, because it is really just a huge resource for laws, policies, example documents, easement language, links to other programs all around both farmland protection, but now we've developed a special collection all around solar and farmland protection. And a lot of those are things that we've referenced in the development of this project. So the link is on several of the pages coming forward, but I'll also put it in the chat momentarily. There's now a smart solar siting landing page at the FIC, which is shorthand for the Farmland Information Center. And we've developed tabs that are stakeholder focused, that we've actually aggregated and curated information that we think is most important for each of these tabs, one specifically being about dual use solar, which we hope folks can take a look and see as a real opportunity. But then there's also just a broad collection that you can search that goes far beyond New England, that has varying types of publications that we've put together for discussions and resources around smart solar siting. Here's just a few examples. You can see that it has the most updated program guidelines from varying states, but it also has statutes that are in place if you need those for reference. And with that, I will take a moment and step back and allow Genevieve to discuss another resource with everyone here.
Thank you so much, Emily. So alongside the Farmland Information Center resources hosted on the farmandenergyinitiative.org website, we have additional resources from what we're calling the Farmland Solar Policy Project, which really comes out of the research that we've been doing on smart solar siting in New England in this coalition. So you can see we have, so the difference sort of between the FIC information and this is that while the FIC is really broken into those stakeholder groups, this information is more broken down by policy topic and policy type that you have heard me talk about over the course of the last couple of webinars. If you click on the policy design toolkit, you're led to a series of about 8 different chapters on how to define solar and farmland in regulatory definitions, what the different energy compensation schemes are in a variety of states, how authority over solar is regulated by state governments versus local governments. And so they're not only examples from New England, but also we're hoping to research all 50 states and have examples of solar development laws within these categories that you can take a look at. Next slide, please. And then if you click on our state law database, this again is sort of similar to the FIC, but organized in a slightly different way. This is a series of state laws and regulations that we have collected relating to solar siting or smart solar siting on farmland specifically. And we have tagged these laws with a variety of sort of category or policy tags that you can see going down the left side. So if you want to focus on, find laws just relating to agrivoltaics, you can select for that, and you can also select for those different array characteristics that I've referenced a few times over the webinar series, like regulating solar by design, by location, or by the size of the array. So we're always adding to this database, and if you happen to know of laws you think should be added, feel free to send them our way. Otherwise, we're going to continue to be adding to this resource as we continue research across the 50 states. Thanks, Emily.
I'm going to pass it off to Sean.
Yeah.
Take it away.
Well, now we'll be joined by our stakeholder panel. And the idea here is just to get a sense of the different perspectives involved in this situation and how we find a path forward that works for everybody and all the different concerns involved. So I will briefly introduce folks, and then they will actually tell us a little more once they start about the work they do. So as I said earlier, we're joined by Lavanya Polavito Barrera from my own organization, Vote Solar, who's our Access and Equity Program Manager. Sue Anderbaugh, who's the Nature Conservancy's Climate and Energy Program Manager in Rhode Island. Brian Wick, the Executive Director of the Cape Cod Cranberry Growers Association, and Zad Shai from Nexium, solar developer in the region. He is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer there. With that, we'll start with Lavanya. Tell us a little bit about your perspective.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. So as Sean said, my name is Lavanya Polavito Barrera. My pronouns are she, hers, and I serve as the Access and Equity Program Manager at Vote Solar. In my role, I ensure that our teams all across the country are building equitable and inclusive tables to drive really good equitable policy outcomes. And I also support our teams in hosting webinars and workshops to reach non-traditional audiences who are usually a part of these kinds of conversations. So thank you for the invitation, Sean. Today, I'm joining you all to talk a little bit about the opportunity that exists in solar to meaningfully engage communities in the project and policy development process. At Vote Solar, we see building authentic and equitable relationships with communities as being core to our work and a part of how we win. Partnerships with frontline communities, communities of color, and low wealth communities are especially critical to ensuring a just transition to a 100% clean energy future. I believe that we cannot claim to work for justice and equity without receiving direct input and the consultation of individuals who have been denied justice for so long. So I came prepared with some recommendations for orgs that are looking to build deeper relationships with communities. And the first recommendation I have is to take stock of your organization and your organizational culture. Reflect on how your organization is seen out in the world. You know, what stories might people have about your organization and your industry? Understanding that while you are an individual in partnerships, you also represent your organization. So your history, be it good or bad, influences how you are perceived. So take a proactive stance and address some uncomfortable points of tension or history when speaking to and approaching new groups that represent communities. Sometimes half the battle in forming new relationships is addressing misconceptions. The next recommendation that I have to offer is to do some homework and research. Research the specific communities you're seeking to work with. What are their strengths? What are organizations that are present in that community working on? What is their vision for the community? How might your work supplement what they are already doing? Taking the time to learn about potential collaborators are a sign of respect and signals commitment to really developing that relationship for the long term. I'd also recommend the setting of intentions. So before initiating any outreach, outlining what your intentions are for building a relationship. Why is this partnership needed? How will it further progress towards your goals and those of your partner? Be clear about the outcomes you hope to actualize and how your goals may or may not be in line with potential partners. I would also encourage you to go a step further and establish organizational partnership principles. Partnership principles define what an equitable partnership looks like for your organization. And this is a process that we just underwent at Vote Solar. This year, we produced what we're calling our Just Partnership Principles. And these are a set of 8 principles that define for us what true equitable partnership looks like. And by doing this, by defining these very clearly and making these publicly available, we're creating a tool for accountability, because we want to hold ourselves to the highest standards, but we also want to empower our partners and collaborators to hold us to that same standard. And the last recommendation I have is to just remain committed and continue to practice. Partnerships require energy, they require time, resources, and action. So the work is necessarily slow because relationships move at the speed of trust. It's important to continue to show up for communities with respect and mutuality in mind. It's important to recognize that mistakes will be made, but what's important is also committing to do better when you get that feedback from potential partners. So those are 4 recommendations that I came prepared with. I'm happy to stick around for questions, and I'll turn it back over to Sean now.
Thanks, Lavanya. That was really helpful. Next, we'll hear from Sue Anderbaugh from the Nature Conservancy.
Hi, everyone. Sean, Emily, and the other organizers, thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to be here, and I've been listening in on these webinars and learning so much, so I'm grateful to be here. So I'm Sue Anderbaugh. I am the Climate Energy Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy's Rhode Island office, Rhode Island chapter. Though I met Emily actually when I was working as Rhode Island's Director of Food System Strategy, which I served in for 4 years. So I'm not speaking in that capacity, but that experience is always in the back of my head when thinking about these types of issues. So we were asked to focus on some opportunities. So I just have like 2.5. But the first is in Rhode Island, we think of solar as a piece of the puzzle about how we get to our science-based climate goals. So we know that the science tells us we need to fully decarbonize by, at the latest, 2050. And the way that we think about it, or we talk about it a lot, is that we know how to get there. There's kind of 3 things we need to do. We need to reduce our emissions, we need to remove emissions, then we need to adapt to unavoidable changes. And reducing emissions includes things like preserving open space and land and other types of natural climate solutions. But in terms of reducing our emissions, solar is going to play a key piece of that puzzle. In terms of here, one of the big opportunities we have is really maximizing the use of roof space, former industrial sites, and other kind of disturbed areas as much as possible. And that's particularly important here in southern New England, like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, where we have a lot of those sites. And I was actually recently really heartened to see the Office of Energy Resource release their report specific to Rhode Island on the potential of those types of disturbed sites and to see just how large that technical potential is. So we need to get creative about thinking about how we make those areas more attractive with incentives and disincentives, making sites, more like business ready. We think about pad readiness for other types of development, and we haven't really had that same conversation for how we make it a softer landing in some of these more difficult places for our solar developers. And we also need to think about kind of how we think about economic development. So we'll need to really build out our solar and other renewables industries in order to continue to power our economies, and they can in fact be a driver of economies. So I know we have a lot of tools we throw at economic development in our states, and I think we need to put our creative hats on to think about how we do that for solar. The next one is thinking about also being creative. How do we get creative in where we site appropriately sited and appropriately sized solar? So once we've maximized all of those roof spaces and the industrial spaces and all of that, and we still have a delta of what we need to power ourselves, thinking creatively. So farming, as I'm sure Brian's going to tell us, and we've heard throughout these webinars, farming is a razor thin margin business. And farmers for a long time have relied on income that's not just farming to stay in farming. I remember talking with some older farmers here in Rhode Island who used to sell off like big chunks of their ice from their ponds in the summer, in the wintertime, like their grandparents did that. And that was another source of income, of just selling the ice from their ponds. And so they've always relied on lots of different sources of income. And keeping farms in farming is a really important part of retaining open space. And so if that includes some small amount of solar or some appropriate amount of solar, whether that, however you can do that in a way that's complementary to the farms, if that keeps the farms in business, that retains that open space as well. And so it can serve both goals. And I think we're seeing really creative things in the cranberry industry. We're seeing creative things with like sheep and goats and other ways that you can be complementary, and it doesn't have to be an either or proposition. Yeah, and so if otherwise we would lose some of that land to farmers needing to sell it for business out, because they need to retire, they need to send kids to college. If they don't have that other source of income, we might lose the land. We might lose more land than we would lose just to the solar development. So yeah, those are the kind of the two things I have around really maximize those industrial spaces, and then let's get creative about how we do it in a way that retains other types of open space, and think it's not just about, ooh, that piece that we lost, but how do we retain the bigger picture? So I'll turn it back to Sean. Thank you so much.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Sue. Brian, why don't you give us a little perspective from the cranberry growers and farmers?
Sure. So we represent the cranberry growers of Massachusetts. Our name suggests Cape Cod, but most of the cranberry farms are off Cape. Only about 10% are on Cape Cod. So they're in southeastern Massachusetts in Plymouth and Bristol County. And there's about 300 cranberry growers, and they're farming about 13,000, a little over 13,000 acres of cranberry bog. And that makes it the #1 food crop in Massachusetts. So it's a very important part of the economy of southeastern Massachusetts. But our growers have been struggling over the past many years with pricing. Sue had mentioned the razor-thin margins, which is true for a lot of agriculture. But in cranberries in particular, the pricing has been very low, in many instances below the cost of production. So to diversify is one of the ways to sustain your farm. And solar provides that opportunity for some of our growers. You can diversify in other ways with different crops and other streams of income, but what solar can provide is that steady stream of income that you can count on. And that, for some of our growers, is an opportunity to keep their farm, their whole farm, going because of that additional income stream. We're not talking a lot of acres in cranberries currently. Actually, we don't have any right now that have been able to complete a dual use agricultural solar project. So dual use, that's where you're farming and have solar on the same piece of land. That's under the new SMART program from Massachusetts. There's one cranberry farm that I'm familiar with that's made it through all the permitting and all the procedures that are necessary, and they're about to start actual construction in a few weeks. So we're close to having one project underway, but there's other projects in the pipeline that are working through the process. But we're probably looking at certainly less than 10% of our acreage is actively pursuing this, and it might even be less than that. That's just a very back of the napkin number, because I don't always hear about all the projects that are moving forward. But with that said, some of the positives for how this works is certainly for cranberries and other ag as well. The land is already cleared. So for a lot of people who have concerns in the community about clearing trees to put solar in, well, the ag has already taken care of that. It's already open land. So that's one benefit right off the top. For cranberries, they're a wetland resource area, and typically they have not, in the past, they've not been allowed to have solar on the actual cranberry bogs themselves. With this new SMART program, because it's a dual use program, you do have to have the ag land working with the solar. So the state has allowed these projects to now be considered to move forward, even though they're technically a wetland resource area. So that's allowing cranberries to participate in a much bigger way than they have before. And overall, it's just a way to keep farmers farming, because that diversified income, it's not for everybody. There are a lot of challenges with dual use, because it is going to change the way that you farm, the way you grow the crop, the way you harvest it. Cranberries are typically harvested wet, and if you haven't seen that before, they flood the bogs. The machines will separate the berries from the vines, and they corral the cranberries and pump them off. So with solar panels out there, that's going to be much more of a challenge. So that is something to consider for some growers. If they're fresh fruit growers, the bogs are dry, and they drive onto them with these machines, and those can very easily go up and down rows of solar panels. So for a dry harvest operation, it's much more straightforward, but the majority of the bogs are wet. So there's challenges there. And that's the same with other forms of ag as well. The farmer's gonna have to work a little differently in order to bring that crop in. Because it hasn't been done before in cranberries, there isn't a lot of data on it, but we have done some preliminary studies, and it's, again, very preliminary, but it is showing some positives to the cranberry crop, where they can retain more of the moisture because the panels are providing some shade. So the vines may not need as much supplemental irrigation, quite possibly. It should help with the summer heat and with scald conditions where the berries will get burnt from the sun and break down. So we think that we're going to see some positives from this, but that is going to be studied, and we certainly have more to learn as time goes on. I would say that the biggest takeaway in all of it, though, is that we need to maintain an ag first mentality. That's what we promote at our association, and other sectors of ag, the same thing. Solar panels can elicit a lot of negative feelings in the community. There's a fair amount of NIMBYism where people are all for solar, but they don't want to see it in their backyard, and I understand that. So it is challenging to find the right spots, having the right infrastructure. For some of our rural communities, the property may not be tied in closely to three-phase power. So it may cost the developer too much money to put the panels there because they have to run lines for such a distance to tie into the three-phase. So some of the growers that are very interested in it, but just might not have good spots. Local zoning is a challenge to make sure that you can have the proper setbacks and screening and things like that. So we have to work through all these things, but we always want to make sure that the farm and the interests of the farmer are being handled first. There's a lot of solar developers out there. Some of them are very good, very reputable, but there's a few that I've come across who are pretty aggressive, and sometimes the needs of the farmer might be overlooked. So that also has to be incorporated into anyone looking at this, is to make sure that they can continue farming the way they need to, so that a dual use solar project is going to be farm first, solar second, to help provide that stability for the farm. So that's my thoughts, and I'll turn it back to you, Sean.
That's really helpful, Brian, and I think a powerful perspective on the situation. Well, I'm excited to tie this panel's first part up, and then we'll go into some Q&A with Zad, who I think is probably one of the good ones when it comes to solar developers, although we'll see what he says and we can judge for ourselves. But looking forward to hearing from you, Zad, and about the solar developer perspective on this balancing of agriculture, conservation, and solar development.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sean. I actually texted Sean when I saw the group. I said, am I sort of playing the role of the big bad developer? And he said, no, maybe. But in all seriousness, thank you for doing this. I think this is really important work, this dialogue. What I'd say is, just for those who are not familiar with Nexamp is not just a developer. We're a national clean energy company, veteran founded, based in Boston. And a lot of our work's in community solar and LMI access. So we were the first solar company to provide discounted community solar subscriptions to members without a credit score, without a long-term contract. And for us, it was clear and important that we not redline the benefits of solar. So so I'll say a few things that are more controversial, because I think it's always good to think hard about what we're doing and if we're on the right path. We're in a climate crisis, period. We are way below where we need to be. And the fact is, all of us, and I'm the father of 3 young kids, are going to have to make certain decisions and trade-offs. The current way of how we're living is not sustainable. It's just not. And with that, we are going to have to reimagine energy infrastructure. And obviously that can be scary. I think, to Brian's point of view, there's a lot of NIMBYism. And, you know, as I think Sue mentioned, there's a lot of interesting opportunities, brownfield, industrial sites, a dual use. But I will just tell you, as someone who's spent 15 years in wind and solar energy efficiency, it's not enough. And that's just the sad reality. If we could do everything on roofs and brownfields economically, we'd be there, but it scratches on the surface. One thing to just comprehend is our grid, if we add transportation to our grid, the generation capacity has to increase by 4 to 5-fold. Just think about that, 4 to 5-fold. So we're not even close to where we are. That being said, honestly, I will tell you, in this group, I think the relationship, to sort of the credit of many on this call, has become better between the clean energy community and the conservation community, the Mass Audubon, and much more productive. I think a few years ago, it was often contentious. And unfortunately, there are a few bad apples in the development community that have made sort of our lives more difficult. where I see the opportunities, I can tell you from a Nexamp perspective, solar for us, and we have many case studies of this, has actually been a big ally to the farming community, especially the small farming community. We just had a recent partner of ours who has a large Christmas tree farm. Obviously, times are not great. You have three options: real estate development, logging, or solar. And sort of I would ask the conservation community, yes, there are going to be tree cuts, but is it better to have a residential development, a logger, or a solar development where you have a microclimate with pollinators that keeps the land sort of still for 25 years and where the nutrients are returned, and then assuming new technologies are, that's returned to nature. And I think we sort of have to have these conversations. And my experience in the past, unfortunately, is there is a level of NIMBYism. I mean, let's just be real. There's hard science. We have to be driven by hard science and data. And look, none of us wants to clear forests, et cetera. I mean, that's not the goal of any of us. We want to make better communities and stronger communities. But we also have to think of it, as Lavanya said, from a equitable angle. Because the whole idea, which and I'm not from Massachusetts, it's always interesting to see the topic, is people in Western Mass, for example, are all concerned about solar farms and siting issues. And then they bring up the issues, let's just put in the inner city on sort of brownfields and rooftops. And that's not right. We got to do better than that. We have to make sure that this is equitable to all communities, because historically in the conservation community, equity has not been a priority. Historically in the energy community, equity has not been a priority. And for us at Nexamp, that is the #1 goal for us, is to democratize solar, no more redlining, and to create an economic engine. The last thing I'll leave with you, COVID is going to leave us as a weakened economy. There's no reality. There's just nothing about, unfortunately, that we can sort of create a brighter picture of it. My hope is us building a new energy infrastructure like we did in Massachusetts in 2010. We'll get people back to work. We'll get people reskilled. We'll hopefully save more farms. But we have to be driven by science and data. For me, just to say an open meadow should be an open meadow is not enough. What is the reason? Is there a carbon reason? Is there an environmental reason? And I know that's sometimes not what people want to hear, but we just have to be driven by science and data. The reason we're here is we have an administration that is not driven by science and data. And the reason sometimes we sort of snipe at one another is it's the shape and look of our neighborhoods. I live in Newton, Massachusetts. It's unbelievable. Everyone is green and wants solar until it's in their backyards. Like, come on, we have solar projects in the Newton Library. And this, to Sue's point, is built environment, and they stop that. So I think we internally have to do a better job, because I will tell you what I've observed. There are a lot of detractors in the solar and wind industry. It's no secret who they are. And they use our well-meaning differences to stymie the growth of the clean energy industry. And that's what scares me. I think that's the biggest danger. If we all don't come to a collective path, outside forces who are scared, or really scared, because we are going to reshape the energy economy in a much better way than we could have ever imagined, hopefully. Something I'm hoping generations will be proud of after us. But they know that there are these differences, and they continue to push on it. And I think the work that Vote Solar has done, Mass Audubon, and others, and I apologize for forgetting any names, have been very helpful. So I'm excited to be part of this dialogue. Please always consider us a partner and friend. We always want to be doing better in the communities. I think community solar has been a game changer also, because when people see a solar farm but they don't have any benefits and it goes to this amorphous grid, it's a little bit harder to stomach. When we go to communities and tell them what the savings are going to be delivered to their school districts, to them as customers, it changes. And for us, we have tried to make sure that we create really vibrant microhabitats around this, and we've worked with Mass Audubon to think through that. Pollinators, beekeeping, among others, right? And we're also sensitive to water use, because part of it is we want to be responsible stewards of water. So I think we've had a little challenges in certain sites about dual use, but we're open to ideas. Again, this is all new for all of us. This is a crisis that has been unfortunately thrust upon us. We're trying to solve something in a very compressed time frame that's been created over the past 2 centuries. And my hope is that these dialogues can be a powerful motivator, so that when we think of new policies, we're not at the opposite ends at the DPU hearings or the DOER hearings. We're all together, because I think that's the only way for us to succeed at this point. So thanks for being part of this, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, and thank you all of you for sharing your opinions. It's clear that we have an urgent question to answer, and a lot of people willing to step up and be a part of that. Emily and I have a few questions for the panelists, and then we'll open up to all of the partners as well. And many of these are from the audience. As a reminder, you can go to the Q&A function and add questions if you have them. Emily, why don't you start?
Thanks, Sean, and thank you all for your really valuable insight, and really appreciate you all taking the time to share your point of view. I think this diverse set of perspectives is essential in this conversation moving forward. So thanks again. I am going to start with Sue. I have a question for you from someone in the audience. How does Rhode Island encourage land protection and farmland protection when the land is so expensive and difficult often for new farmers to access? And I suppose this would also work for other types of conservation. It's much more lucrative often to sell to development. So how do you balance this, and how do you protect this land?
Great question. So you're totally right. The land in Rhode Island, particularly for farming, in Rhode Island, we have the most expensive farmland in the country due to our compressed size and a variety of different factors. But then also when we think about our forest land, most of our forest land is also privately owned. And so when people say, oh, we can't allow development in certain areas, it's owned by a myriad of different people. You can't just say what people cannot do on their own property. So it creates an interesting conundrum. But a few of the things that TNC has been focused on, particularly as it pertains to renewables development, is thinking about, not saying no to things, but saying, how do we do this in a way that's smart, in a way that both gives you, if you want to develop on your land to do solar or wind or what have you, how do we do that in a way that supports you and also preserves some of that land? So, limiting size or not having multiple large systems right next to each other. So we have 2 programs in Rhode Island. We both have net metering, but we also have the Renewable Energy Growth Program, which is similar but much scaled back from the Massachusetts SMART program. And the Renewable Energy Growth Program does have some rules around you can't have multiple projects kind of just stacked next to each other, whereas virtual net metering in Rhode Island does not have those rules. So we've been advocating for, let's just think about how we're allowing projects to be placed if they're getting incentives from the state. So that's been something that we've been really focused on. TNC also, we're one of the largest landowners in the state. So we're trying to identify where some of those really important pieces of land are, particularly forest land and other open space, and helping to conserve it and letting people use it. And that's both, like, we do work in urban areas, we do work in the rural areas, but we're trying to be a really good partner as it pertains to keeping land open and putting our support where our mouth is, and not just saying, you guys should really do that, but saying, okay, how can we help you? How can we figure out where the most important pieces of land are, the places where the wildlife habitats connect to other places, and can we help you with that? I'll also say 2 other quick things. One is, actually I'll save that one for later, but one other thing I'll share, just to talk up my good friend and former colleague Ken Ayers, who's the chief of the Division of Agriculture in Rhode Island, and I'm not sure if he's listening in on this, but he and his team have thought of some really creative solutions that they've been piloting over the last few years as it pertains to particularly farmland preservation. One in particular, which they've just started piloting in the last few years, which is where the state will actually, if a farmer is ready to retire or would like to sell his or her land, the Department of Environmental Management can buy that land they can buy it outright, and then retain the development rights and sell it at farm value. And so it makes it a lot more the hope is that it'll make it a lot more accessible to farmers, particularly non-generational farmers, but farmers of all types. So farmers who don't have otherwise have access to land. They've also done that in more urban areas, or they've also done conservation of property also in more urban areas, so that there's more access for particularly like immigrant farmers and refugee farmers who in Rhode Island tend to be clustered in the urban areas, but though not exclusively. So trying to throw as many tools at it as possible, but recognizing that it definitely is a challenge, especially in such a heavy populated state.
That's really helpful, Sue. Thank you, and thorough. I have a question actually for maybe Lavanya and Zad, which is, and Lavanya, you can start, but curious for both your perspectives. Zad, you joked about being the big bad developer coming into the room, and Lavanya, you talked about owning your history and stories that might follow you when you enter a room. How do you go into a community in a way that combats this image of sort of the worst image of a solar farm that people imagine, a developer that's just going to ram through development in the most valuable land? You know, people have this "not in my backyard." We also heard that language. Very valid concerns about what the worst case could be, and they often come with that baggage. How do developers or others who are supporting solar projects come with an awareness of that and try and actually get around it or work with that? So maybe Lavanya, you could give us some tips to start, and then Zad, really curious how you all do this at Nexam.
Sure, that's a great question. So yeah, I think developers oftentimes are put in this position where they have to actively build trust. They don't come in with the benefit of the doubt oftentimes. And so my suggestion would be to really be approaching local groups from a listening and learning stance first. I would encourage developers to build in time for outreach and engagement into their work plans, include that in your project timelines. I would suggest that initiating outreach with just a simple conversation, let's have a virtual lunch, a coffee chat. I want to learn about what it is that you're working on in the community. And in that first conversation, I would encourage developers to be attuned to opportunities where they can support something that a local group is already working on. So for instance, can you offer to promote an upcoming event on your social media or your newsletter? Can you sponsor a table at an upcoming fundraiser that a community group is hosting? Or even offering to lead an educational session on solar and energy programs in the area to increase energy literacy in the community. I think it's important to be creative and bold when it comes to imagining up ideas for collaboration, and working together on something small first pays off and goes a long way when it comes to working and building trust for something bigger in the future.
That's great. Zad, any thoughts to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in the fortunate position where we're not a developer, we're long-term owners. So when we go into communities, we're part of the community, and we engage, and we've done education programs with the Boy Scouts. We delivered several $100,000s of PPE during COVID because through our logistics network, we were able to procure stuff from China, just given we have a supply chain there. But again, it's being authentic and doing the right thing. It sounds easy, but for some reason, a lot of people don't need to hear those principles. We're very confident in the benefits of it, even in solar, in farmland or some open land. But most of the community tends to support it for several reasons. One is it prevents real estate development. I sometimes think solar, we're held to a higher standard, which is fine, and I think we should be. But the idea is that real estate development is continuing to take more open land than solar in Massachusetts, but the administration, and I think this is where again we fall into, we open up our grievances, and this administration in Massachusetts really drives a hole through solar because of that. So let's stop real estate development and stop that expansion of, and trust me, real estate development is much worse from water use, etc. Hands down. But you know, that's what I worry about. But Sean, to your point, as we go in these communities, we make sure there's enough support for solar. A lot of them tend to be farm owners, driving ranges, because those economics of golf driving ranges aren't great. I'd say from an environmental standpoint, it's better to have a solar farm than a driving range when you're having to consistently water grass, fertilize, runoff, etc. And then it's also making sure that you authentically can deliver benefits to the community long term. I think to Lavania's point, doing a table on that, I think can sometimes be a little cheesy. It's like, are you trying to buy the community, or are you trying to actually engage and be part of the community? And people can smell that out really quickly. So that's been a big part of our belief system, using subcontractors as much as possible that are local, working with unions and non-unions to build support. And also, you know, proactively, we have been taking steps as a company to engage environmental groups and conservation groups there. We may not always see eye to eye, which is fine, but we're going to make that step and we're going to make that engagement. We're not going to ignore it.
Really helpful. Well, I think Emily has one last question for this panel, but perhaps partners can turn their webcams on and we'll dive into some other Q&As for everybody after this.
Thanks, Sean. Brian, we've got one for you. There's a question about if farmers really want dual use, and I know you can speak more from the Cranberry perspective, but do they really want dual use when it's such a complicated design and it may be just ultimately more profitable to simply turn over land to a more standard design and for that, those lease payments?
So certainly dual use ag is not for everybody, because it is going to change how you farm. So for some growers, they might say, that's not for me, I'm going to try to survive in other ways. But there's a lot that are interested in it, both in cranberries and outside other sectors of ag. So there is definitely those who are willing to take that chance, and they're innovative. They'll figure out different ways of harvesting, different ways of growing the crop. So yes, that demand is definitely there, but it's not for everybody.
Great.
Thank you.
Deborah,
All right, we'll open this up to everybody. Sean, do you have another question lined up?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know we had a simple one, maybe clarification that Deborah can offer about why the Brattle Group numbers seem to be different from the Acadia Center numbers on need of solar.
Sure. Thanks, Sean, and thanks for the question from the audience. I will say, first of all, that there was a gap of about 2 to 3 years between the releases of the two studies, where the Acadia Center Energy Vision did come out much earlier. We were studying a scenario toward 2030, and the Brattle Group did a study of 80% by 2050. So we have different timescales, but one thing I do want to point out is that the rapidly changing nature of our energy system and the economics of solar are probably playing a big part in the differences between the conclusions of our two studies. In particular, I think Brattle is taking into account correctly the need for full electrification of our buildings and our transportation system, which drives up demand, which creates an even greater need for more generation to be added to the system. And also the dramatic cost declines in solar in recent years as well. I think, when that gets factored into studies that have been done, in the last year or that will be done this year, it's going to show that solar actually can really, really dominate the energy mix going forward. And the International Energy, the IEA, just released a study yesterday that showed that globally that the cost of solar is coming down so far that it's beating out economically existing gas and coal, meaning cheaper to build new solar than it is to keep the coal and the gas generation running, just even to keep it around what we have. And turnover is going to be the name of the game, especially as we electrify the whole economy. So I would say the Brattle studies, it's a good one. It's very reliable. So is the Acadia Center, but there's not quite an apples to apples comparison of the two. So stuff that's done more recently will take those types of things into account.
Thanks.
Thanks, Deb. We probably have time for one more question. Sean, do you have a good one lined up, or you want me to pick one from the list?
Well, one interesting one to Deborah's point, and curious if anybody has thoughts on this, but a lot of the development we've seen in the region has been in the sort of 1 to 5 megawatt zone. So we're talking about 5 to 30 acres of land. But when we look at the long-term crisis we're facing with climate change, a lot of people are thinking that utility scale solar may be a part of the solution required in New England, and the siting problems become much more complicated at that larger scale, even larger than that. So curious what people think in terms of A, what the role of utility scale solar might be, and then how do we, and are there differences in how we approach siting as we look at utility scale solar? Maybe Genevieve, you could start. I'd be interested in utility scale solar policy existing in the region. Is it happening? Is there support for it? And then can see if others want to pop up.
So I think that the short answer to how developed is sort of small scale policy versus how developed is utility scale policy is that the states have been much more focused and sort of have more robust programs for, residential scale, commercial scale customers than utility scale. But, and I think there are a number of different reasons for that. One of which is that a lot of large scale projects sort of size out of a lot of state regulation and state programs and maybe doing things like bidding into the wholesale market. And so we're not as able to incentivize them or control them through rates or through siting requirements that they are not, where they're not eligible for these programs, or they're not going to, they're getting paid in different ways. And then I think from a sort of even dual use perspective, when we have the landowner benefiting both from the solar energy and from the land itself, I think you have different incentives versus when you have a solar developer actually getting paid for the energy and maybe just paying the farmer a lease payment for utility scale land. And I think it makes a difference when you have those multiple different parties involved in deciding what the land use is, because then you're talking about things like grazing contracts or finding farmers to come in and do activities on land that otherwise is just being sort of operated and owned by a solar developer. So I think it's complicated, but I think the small scale projects really do provide some models for things we could be doing at the utility scale. And I have started hearing about dual use utility scale more on projects in the Midwest than New England.
Interesting, thank you. We probably have time for one person to give a quick addition to this.
Yeah, Sean, if I may. Yeah, I think utility scale solar is not a great idea for New England. One is just from an economic standpoint, with the drive down in costs, 1 through 5 megawatts is a sweet spot. And really, there is not a huge additional benefit to utility scale solar. So as I'm sure developers will try to argue such because there's bigger profits, but the reality is just from a levelized cost of electricity, 1 through 5 is really the right number. Number 2 is just the siting issues will be horrific. And my worry is if you launch utility scale solar into New England, and we started seeing this in New York, the pushback against DG solar development became much stronger. because it really created this downdraft. So I think it could really damage this whole industry. And lastly, it's how do we create a grid? The utilities want big central power plants because they control transmission and distribution. So they will push us to go through that angle. That's why offshore wind, which is necessary, they're much more excited about. I, and taking off my Nexamp hat, believe that you need a much more distributed network. So if one power plant is knocked down, you have multiple nodes. That's where the technology world has gone. I think that's where the energy world's gone. I think the pressure for utility scale solar is going to come from the utilities because there's a lot more profit and control that they're going to drive from transmission and distribution. Same thing with the ISOs. It's a much more interesting proposition for them. I think if we keep it distributed, it's a much more resilient network, especially with climate change in the Northeast. Unfortunately, on the coast, we're going to see more severe weather patterns. It's going to be a much more reliable energy infrastructure grid, especially as we integrate storage into these solar power plants.
Great points. Thank you. Emily, do you want to tie things up?
Yes. Thanks again to all of our guests today. Thank you for everyone who's attended, both today and our previous webinars. We hope that this has been valuable and can really be a resource, not only these webinars, but also the resources on the Farmland Information Center and on the Farm and Energy Initiative as part of VLS. And the 3 links that you see right now are where a lot of those resources can be found, including all of the analyses. These recordings and these slides will be posted on those. So one last thank you to everyone who shared their thoughts and opinions today, and a thank you to our funders, the John Merck Foundation, the Barr Foundation, and National Agricultural Library. And we hope that this conversation is just the beginning and that we see movement towards both our clean energy and our land conservation and farming goals. So thank you all. Hope everyone has a lovely afternoon and have a great weekend after that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Emily. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.